Shadow of the Iron Fist. Chapter 1: The Last Master. Master Chen Wei had spent 15 years teaching children the discipline of Wing Chun in the basement of Mrs. Rodriguez's community center, far from the neon-soaked streets of New Harbor's downtown core. At 52, his hands bore the calluses of 10,000 strikes against wooden dummies, and his eyes held the quiet confidence of a man who had once been called the Iron Fist of Shanghai. But that was another life, before he'd fled to America with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a promise to his dying Sifu to never use his skills for violence again. The promise lasted until Detective Sarah Kim showed up at his dojo with photographs of his star pupil, 16-year-old Marcus Thompson, beaten unconscious in an alley. The Crimson Serpent syndicate, they're not just dealing drugs anymore, they're taking over the city block by block, forcing small businesses to pay protection money or face consequences. Marcus's family owns the corner market. They refuse to pay. Chen's weathered fingers traced the edge of a photograph showing Marcus's swollen face. The boy had been coming to classes for 3 years, transforming from a gangly kid afraid of his own shadow into someone who carried himself with quiet dignity. The police can't touch Victor Kozlov. He's got judges in his pocket, city councilmen on his payroll. Half my own department looks the other way when his name comes up, but you... I know what you were before you came here. The stories from Hong Kong, Shanghai. They say you single-handedly took down the Black Dragon Triad. Stories are just stories, but his hands had unconsciously formed the eagle claw position. Muscle memory from decades of training. Marcus isn't the first kid they've hurt, won't be the last. This neighborhood, these families, they look up to you. You could make a difference. Chen closed his eyes, hearing his master's voice.
A true warrior fights only to protect those who cannot protect themselves.
When he opened them again, Detective Kim saw something that made her step back involuntarily. A glimpse of the predator that had once prowled the shadow wars of the Hong Kong underworld. Tell me about Kozlov.
Shadow of the Iron Fist Chapter 2. The Serpent's Nest. Victor Kozlov operated from the renovated Meridian Hotel, a 40-story monument to corruption that rose like a glass and steel middle finger toward the sky. What had once been New Harbor's crown jewel now served as headquarters for the most sophisticated criminal organization the city had ever seen. Kozlov had learned from the mistakes of previous crime bosses. No gaudy displays of wealth, no unnecessary violence, no movie villain theatrics. He ran his empire like a Fortune 500 company, complete with quarterly profit reports and corporate restructuring. The Crimson Serpent had departments, logistics, human resources, and public relations, but even corporate criminals needed muscle, and Kozlov had recruited the best. His lieutenant Dmitry the Sledgehammer Volkov was a former Spetsnaz operative who could crush a man's windpipe with his thumb. His enforcer teams were composed of ex-military specialists from a dozen different countries, each one a walking weapon trained to kill efficiently and without emotion. Chen spent 3 days watching the Meridian, mapping guard rotations, identifying weak points, studying the rhythm of Kozlov's operations. On the 4th night, he made his move. The first 2 guards never saw him coming. Chen moved through the shadows of the parking garage like smoke, his footsteps silent on concrete. A pressure point strike to the neck dropped the first man unconsciously to the ground. The second guard turned at the sound of his partner's falling keys, just in time to see Chen's palm strike heading for his solar plexus. But Chen had underestimated Kozlov's preparation. Hidden cameras had tracked his approach, and by the time he reached the service elevator, 10 armed men were waiting. Master Chen Wei came a cultured voice over hidden speakers. The Iron Fist of Shanghai honors us with his presence. I'm afraid you'll find the Crimson Serpent somewhat more challenging than the back alley gangs of your youth. The first gunman opened fire, but Chen was already moving, his body flowing like water around the deadly hail of bullets. A rising knee strike shattered one man's ribs. A spinning heel kick sent another crashing into a concrete pillar. But there were too many, and they'd spread out too far for traditional martial arts to be effective. Chen rolled behind a parked car just as automatic weapons fire shredded the air where he'd been standing. Glass and metal fragments rained down around him as he calculated his options. This wasn't going to be one with honor and tradition. Kozlov had turned the city into a battlefield, and Chen would have to adapt or die. From his jacket, he withdrew a small device Detective Kim had provided, a military-grade flashbang grenade. Sometimes, Chen reflected grimly, even ancient wisdom had to bow to modern warfare.
The explosion at the Meridian Hotel made the morning news, but the official story bore no resemblance to reality. A gas leak, the reporters claimed. Structural damage to the parking garage. 10 security guards hospitalized with various injuries sustained during the evacuation. Chen watched the coverage from his dojo, noting how quickly Kozlov's media connections had spun the narrative. No mention of the crates of heroin found by responding officers. No questions about why a hotel needed so much armed security. No investigation into the suspicious number of guests who checked out within hours of the incident. But the message had been sent, and Kozlov's response was swift and vicious. By noon, 3 more businesses in Chen's neighborhood had been torched. The Ramirez family's restaurant, Mrs. Chen's no-relation laundromat, and the community center where Chen taught his classes. The message was clear. If the neighborhood harbored the Iron Fist, the neighborhood would pay. Chen stood in the smoldering ruins of his dojo, salvaging what he could from 15 years of careful building. His wooden dummy, hand-carved by his master in Shanghai, had been reduced to splinters. The mirrors where countless students had practiced their forms were shattered fragments reflecting the smoke-filled sky. Mrs. Rodriguez wept openly as she surveyed the damage.
40 years I've run this center, she said. 40 years helping kids stay off the streets, giving them somewhere safe to go. And now?
Now we fight back, Chen said quietly. She turned to stare at him, startled by the steel in his voice. Kozlov thinks he can terrorize this community into submission. He believes that fear is stronger than resolve, that money is more powerful than justice. He's about to learn otherwise. Detective Kim arrived as the fire department finished dousing the last of the flames. She found Chen sitting on the front steps, methodically cleaning his hands with a wet cloth.
I've got bad news and worse news, she said. The bad news is that my captain has officially ordered me to stay away from anything involving the Meridian Hotel incident. The worst news is that Kozlov has put $1 million bounty on your head, half that for anyone who helps you.
Chen looked up at her. And what's the good news?
Kim smiled grimly and opened her jacket, revealing a tactical vest loaded with weapons and equipment. The good news is that I never was very good at following orders. Besides, someone needs to watch your back while you tear this city apart looking for justice.
This isn't your fight, Chen warned.
The hell it isn't. I've been trying to clean up these streets through proper channels for 10 years, watching scum like Kozlov buy their way out of every case I built. Maybe it's time to try improper channels.
Chen studied her face, seeing the same quiet resolve that had driven him from Shanghai to Hong Kong to New Harbor. Detective Sarah Kim had reached the same crossroads he'd faced as a young man, the point where the system's failures demanded individual action. Kozlov has 40 trained killers, an army of street soldiers, and half the city government in his pocket, Chen said. What do we have?
Kim patted the radio clipped to her vest. We have something he doesn't. People who actually live in this city and want to see it survive. I've been making calls all morning. Turns out a lot of cops, firefighters, and even some military folks are getting tired of watching New Harbor rot from the inside.
Chen nodded slowly. Then we'll need a plan, and we'll need to move fast, before Kozlov realizes he's not just fighting one man anymore.
The Shadow of the Iron Fist, Chapter 4, The Art of War. Kozlov's mistake was believing that superior firepower guaranteed victory. He'd studied Chen's background, knew about the Hong Kong triads and the Shanghai underground wars, but he'd failed to understand the most important lesson of Chen's past. The Iron Fist had never fought alone. The real secret of Chen's legendary status wasn't his martial arts mastery. It was his ability to unite disparate groups against a common enemy. In Hong Kong, he'd forged an alliance between rival gangs to overthrow the corrupt police commissioner who'd been selling children to human traffickers. In Shanghai, he'd convinced dock workers, businessmen, and even Communist Party officials to work together against the Black Dragon Triad. Now, in New Harbor, he was about to do it again. The war began at midnight on a Tuesday with coordinated strikes across the city. While Kozlov's attention focused on protecting his headquarters and key operations, Chen's unlikely army hit where it hurt most, the infrastructure that made the Crimson Serpent's empire possible. Detective Kim led a team of off-duty police officers in simultaneous raids on 3 money laundering operations, seizing records and freezing accounts that Kozlov had spent years establishing. Captain Rodriguez, Mrs. Rodriguez's nephew and a decorated Marine veteran, coordinated attacks on drug distribution centers with a squad of military reservists who'd volunteered their leave time for the cause. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: the city's IT workers union. Tommy Chang, a systems administrator who'd grown up taking classes at Chen's dojo, had spent weeks infiltrating Kozlov's computer networks. At precisely 12:01 a.m., every digital system the Crimson Serpent relied on began to fail. Bank transfers froze mid-transaction. Encrypted communications channels broadcast their conversations to police frequencies. Security cameras throughout the organization began displaying a simple message: the Iron Fist remembers. Chen himself hit 3 separate Crimson Serpent safe houses, moving through the city like a ghost. No longer bound by the restraint he'd maintained during his years of teaching, he fought with the fluid lethality that had made him legendary. But he wasn't the same man who'd terrorized the Hong Kong underworld. He was better, tempered by years of discipline and focused by righteous purpose. At the first safe house, he found 8 guards and enough fentanyl to poison half the city. The guards had guns. Chen had 15 years of accumulated anger over every student who'd been threatened, every family that had been terrorized, every dream that Kozlov's organization had crushed. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes. The second location housed Kozlov's human trafficking operation, young women from Eastern Europe held in conditions that made Chen's blood burn with fury. Here, he didn't even try to be non-lethal. Some sins, he'd learned, could only be answered with permanent solutions. By dawn, the Crimson Serpent's empire was in freefall. Police sirens wailed across the city as legitimate law enforcement finally had enough evidence and political cover to act. Emergency rooms filled with Kozlov's injured soldiers. News vans surrounded the Meridian Hotel as reporters sensed the biggest story in New Harbor's history. But Chen wasn't finished. The head of the Serpent still remained. Kozlov waited for Chen in the Meridian's penthouse, surrounded by the last dozen members of his personal guard. Gone was the composed businessman who'd run his criminal empire like a corporation. The man who stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the burning remnants of his organization was a cornered predator, dangerous in the way that only desperate men could be. "You've cost me everything," Kozlov said without turning around as Chen emerged from the stairwell. The elevators had been cut hours ago, just one more small victory in Tommy Chang's electronic warfare campaign. "You cost yourself everything," Chen replied, walking slowly across the marble floor. "The moment you decided that this city belonged to you instead of the people who live in it." Kozlov finally turned, and Chen saw that the Russian was holding a detonator. Heroic words. But I wonder how heroic you'll feel when you realize I've wired this entire building with enough explosives to level 6 city blocks. Everyone dies tonight, Master Chen. My men, your friends, the families in the surrounding buildings, everyone. You're willing to murder thousands of innocent people rather than face justice? I'm willing to ensure that my defeat doesn't become other people's victory. If I can't rule this city, no one can. Chen calculated distances, angles, the time it would take to cross the room versus the time needed to trigger an explosion. The mathematics of violence refined through decades of life and death encounters. But before he could move, Dmitry Volkov stepped out from behind a pillar, assault rifle trained on Chen's chest. "The famous Iron Fist," Dmitry rumbled in heavily accented English. "In Spetsnaz we heard stories about you. They said you once killed 30 men with your bare hands." "I've never counted," Chen said honestly. "Tonight you won't need to count past 1. But Dmitry had made the same mistake as every other opponent Chen had faced over the years. He'd assumed that martial arts mastery was the only weapon in Chen's arsenal. The throwing star that took him in the throat came from Chen's left hand while his right remained perfectly still, giving no indication of the attack until it was too late. Kozlov's remaining guards opened fire, but Chen was already in motion, using Dmitry's falling body as cover while he rolled toward the nearest pillar. Marble columns that had been designed to impress visitors now became tactical assets in a deadly game of urban warfare. The firefight that followed was brief and vicious. Chen moved through the penthouse like a force of nature, using every advantage the environment provided. A champagne flute became a projectile that shattered one guard's shooting glasses. A marble ashtray caved in another's skull. The antique samurai sword mounted on Kozlov's wall, obviously a prop chosen for intimidation rather than function, still held enough of an edge to do terrible work in the hands of someone who understood steel. When the shooting stopped, Chen stood alone among the bodies, facing Kozlov across 20 feet of blood-stained marble. "The detonator," Chen said quietly. Kozlov laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think you've won something here? You think killing me will change anything? There are a dozen organizations waiting to move into the territory I leave behind. Worse organizations. At least I had rules, standards. What comes next will make the Crimson Serpent look like Sunday school." "Maybe," Chen acknowledged, "but that's tomorrow's war. Tonight you answer for what you've done to this city." "And what about what you've done tonight? How many men have you killed? How many lives have you destroyed? What makes you different from me?" Chen considered the question seriously. It was one he'd asked himself many times over the years, standing in the aftermath of violence, wondering if justice and vengeance were really different things or just different names for the same dark impulse. "The difference," he said finally, "is that when this is over, I'll go back to teaching children how to defend themselves. You would have kept taking everything from everyone until there was nothing left to take." Kozlov's hand tightened on the detonator. "Noble words. Let's see how noble they sound to the ghosts of everyone who dies when I press this button." But the expected explosion never came. Instead, Kozlov looked down in confusion at the device in his hand, pressing the trigger repeatedly with growing desperation. "Looking for this?" Detective Kim's voice came from the stairwell as she held up a complex electronic device. "Turns out our IT guy is pretty good with bomb disposal too. The charges were disarmed about an hour ago." Chen smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in days. "It's over, Kozlov." The Russian crime boss looked around the penthouse, taking in the bodies of his guards, the destruction of his empire, the complete collapse of everything he'd built. When he looked back at Chen, there was something like respect in his eyes. "You know what the worst part is?" Kozlov said. "I actually believed I was making this city better. More efficient, more profitable, more orderly than the chaos that came before." "Order built on fear isn't order," Chen replied. "It's just well-organized oppression." Kozlov nodded slowly, then reached into his jacket. Chen tensed, but instead of a weapon, the Russian produced a simple business card. "My lawyer's number. He'll cooperate fully with the authorities, account numbers, political contacts, everything. Consider it my final act of efficiency."
The Shadow of the Iron Fist. Epilogue. The New Dawn. 6 months later, Chen stood in the rebuilt community center, watching a class of 30 children practice their forms. The new dojo was larger than the old one, funded by asset seizures from Kozlov's organization and donations from grateful citizens who had seen their neighborhoods transform from war zones back into communities. Marcus Thompson, fully recovered from his beating, had become Chen's assistant instructor. The 16-year-old moved with the confident grace of someone who had learned that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the courage to protect what mattered. Detective Kim had been promoted to Captain Kim, tasked with heading a new anti-corruption task force. The successful campaign against the Crimson Serpent had given honest cops the political cover they needed to clean house throughout the department. Victor Kozlov was serving multiple life sentences in federal prison, but his cooperation had led to the arrest of 47 city officials, 12 judges, and an entire network of corrupt businesses. The trials were expected to continue for years, but New Harbor was already showing signs of recovery. Chen himself had changed too. The man who had once been called the Iron Fist had learned that sometimes the greatest victories came not from crushing enemies, but from building something worth defending. His dojo had become more than a martial arts school. It was a community center, a safe haven, and a symbol that ordinary people could fight back against those who would prey upon them. "Master Chen?" Marcus approached after dismissing the evening class. "There is a reporter outside. Says she wants to interview the Iron Fist about cleaning up the city." Chen shook his head. "Tell her the Iron Fist is retired. But if she wants to talk to a martial arts instructor about teaching kids self-respect and community pride, I will have a few minutes." As the last students filtered out into the evening, Chen looked around his rebuilt dojo and felt something he had not experienced in decades. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the deeper calm that came from knowing he had found his true purpose. Outside, New Harbor hummed with the busy energy of a city healing itself. There would be other challenges, other fights, other corruptions that needed to be confronted. But there would also be people willing to stand up and fight back. Teachers and cops, students and parents, immigrants and natives, all united by the simple belief that their community was worth defending. The Iron Fist had taught them well. In the end, that was the only victory that mattered.